An elderly couple, forgotten by their own children and surviving on scraps, paid just $800 for a condemned Victorian house everyone else was too afraid to touch. And when they finally opened the door that had been sealed for 43 years, what they found inside didn't just change their lives. It exposed a secret so massive, so dangerous, that it would force them to choose between the family who abandoned them and a fortune worth $200 million. Before we dive into this story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning cold bit through Harold Patterson's worn jacket as he stood in the parking lot of Riverside County Auction House, his hands trembling not from the November chill but from something deeper, the kind of trembling that comes from 74 years of disappointment, teaching your body to expect nothing good. Beside him, his wife Marge clutched a thermos of weak coffee they'd split that morning, her silver hair tucked under a threadbare scarf she'd owned since the Reagan administration. They looked like what they were, two people the world had quietly agreed to forget. The auction house smelled like dust and broken dreams, that particular scent of other people's abandoned belongings waiting for someone desperate enough to claim them. Harold had circled the listing in the newspaper 3 weeks ago, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he studied the grainy photo of a 3-story Victorian house on the edge of town. Condemned property. The listing read, structural concerns. Sold as is. Minimum bid $800. $800. That was almost everything they had left after rent, after medicine, after the phone bill they kept active, in case one of their children ever called. They never did. Harold's fingers traced the folded newspaper clipping in his jacket pocket, a nervous habit he'd developed over the past 3 weeks. Every time doubt crept in, every time Marge looked at him with worry in her eyes, he'd touch that clipping like a talisman, like it held some promise of a future different from the one they'd been living. A future that wasn't just about survival, but about something more. They'd arrived an hour early, parking their ancient Buick at the far edge of the lot where the newer cars wouldn't have to look at it. The Buick was 23 years old, rust eating through the wheel wells, the passenger door held shut with a bungee cord because the latch had broken 2 years ago, and they couldn't afford to fix it. Harold had patched the muffler with a soup can and wire hangers. It sounded like a dying animal when it ran, but it ran, and that was what mattered. Marge had packed them sandwiches for lunch, white bread, and the cheap lunch meat that came in those vacuum-sealed packages. But Harold knew she'd only eat half of hers. She always did, saving the rest for later. Which really meant saving it for him because she'd secretly watched him lose weight over the past year, watched him pretend he wasn't hungry when there wasn't enough food to go around. That was marriage at 73, Harold thought. Not the romance of youth, not the passion of middle age, but the quiet sacrifice of making sure the person you love eats when you're both starving. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Inside the auction house, metal folding chairs had been arranged in rows facing a makeshift podium. A projection screen showed property photos, rotating on a loop. Harold and Marge took seats in the back row, as if even here they needed to make themselves small, invisible. Around them, men and women in business casual shuffled through paperwork. Real estate flippers, Harold guessed, with their rolled-up blueprints and confident postures. Contractors, with paint-stained jeans and measuring tapes clipped to their belts, people who belonged here, who knew what they were doing. Harold felt acutely aware of his threadbare jacket, the one with the frayed cuffs that Marge had tried to repair with needle and thread, of his work boots that had been resoled twice because new ones cost too much, of the way other people's eyes slid past him, and Marge like they were furniture, like they were part of the wall. Michael, their oldest son, had looked at him that way at his retirement party. Harold remembered it clearly, even though it had been over 2 decades ago. 23 years of service at the rail yard. 23 years of early mornings and late nights, of coming home with grease under his nails and exhaustion in his bones. The company had thrown him a party cake from the grocery store, a handshake from his supervisor, a cheap watch that stopped working after 3 months. His children had come. Michael had flown in from Seattle, where he worked for some tech company Harold didn't understand. Sarah had driven up from her suburb 40 minutes away. Daniel had shown up late, mumbling apologies about traffic. They'd stood around eating cake and checking their phones, counting the minutes until they could leave. Marge had baked Harold's favorite lemon cake, the one with the cream cheese frosting that took her all afternoon to make. She'd arranged it on a nice platter, set it on the refreshment table with pride. Harold had watched throughout the evening, watched as people took slices of the store-bought sheet cake, and ignored Marge's offering. By the end of the night, her cake sat almost untouched, one sad slice missing from the corner where Harold had cut it himself, just to make her feel better. He'd found it in the trash the next morning when he went to take out the garbage. Someone had thrown it away, platter and all. Marge had never said anything about it, but Harold knew she'd noticed. Knew she'd felt the same dismissal he had, the same casual cruelty of being irrelevant. That was when the silence between them and their children had really begun. Not a dramatic break, no shouting or accusations, just a slow fading, like a photograph left in sunlight. The phone calls became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. Birthday cards went from elaborate to perfunctory to non-existent. Holidays passed without visits, without invitations, without even the pretense of caring. Michael had married someone who found Harold and Marge embarrassing, too old-fashioned, too poor, too unsophisticated for the life they were building in Seattle. Sarah had her own family to worry about, her own problems, and somehow there was never room in her schedule for her aging parents. Daniel had simply disappeared into whatever life he'd built, leaving no forwarding address and no explanation. 3 children, 50-some years of raising them, loving them, sacrificing for them, and in return, silence. Not even the courtesy of a monthly check-in call. Just nothing. As if Harold and Marge had ceased to exist the moment they stopped being useful. So they'd learned to make do. Harold's pension was small. The rail yard hadn't offered much in benefits, and what little they'd saved had been depleted by medical bills and car repairs, and the 1,000 small emergencies that plague people who can't afford emergencies. Marge's Social Security added to his, but together, it barely covered rent on the 1-bedroom apartment above the laundromat, the place where the walls were so thin you could hear every argument from the neighbors, and the hot water only worked if you ran it before 6 in the morning. Marge's arthritis had gotten worse. Harold could see it in the way her hands curled when she thought he wasn't looking, in how long it took her to get out of bed in the morning. The medication her doctor prescribed cost $230 a month. Their budget allowed for $115, so Marge took half doses, cutting the pills carefully with a knife, pretending the pain wasn't grinding her down day by day. Harold had sold his wedding ring 6 months ago when the Buick's transmission started slipping. He'd told Marge he'd lost it, had turned the apartment upside down in a fake search, while she worried and helped him look. The pawn shop had given him $320. The transmission repair had cost $350. He'd made up the difference by skipping lunches for 2 weeks. That was their life. Small deceptions and quiet sacrifices. Two people trying to maintain dignity while the world insisted they had none left to maintain. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man with a voice like gravel grinding against itself, stepped up to the podium. He wore a bolo tie and cowboy boots, playing up some Western authenticity that felt performative in suburban Riverside County. He shuffled his papers and cleared his throat. "All right, folks, let's get started. We've got 17 properties today. Some nice opportunities for you investors and contractors. Remember, these are all as-is sales. No warranties, no guarantees. You buy it. You own it. Problems and all." The first few properties went quickly. A foreclosed ranch house with fire damage went for $43,000. Harold watched the bidding, watched how casually these people threw around numbers that would have changed his and Marge's entire lives. A commercial lot near the highway sold for $78,000. Someone's storage unit full of tools went for $1,200. Then the auctioneer reached lot 14. "Okay, this next one's interesting," he said, and Harold could hear the skepticism in his voice. Victorian house, built in 1976 on Thornhill Road. 3 stories, original hardwood floors, some nice architectural details. But, and this is a big but, folks, it's been sitting empty since 1981. That's over 40 years vacant. City's got it marked for demolition if nobody claims it within 90 days. He clicked to the next slide, and the Victorian appeared on the screen. Even in the grainy photo, Harold could see its bones were good. The steep gables, the tower room, the wraparound porch. It was massive. The kind of house that had been built with pride, with craftsmanship, with the expectation that it would last. Structural engineer's report shows foundation concerns. The auctioneer continued. Possible water damage. Electrical needs to be completely redone. Plumbing's ancient, and the whole place needs to be brought up to current code. Roof's probably shot. Windows are broken. I'll be honest with you. This is a project. A big project. The room was silent. Harold could feel the weight of that silence, could feel everyone calculating costs and risks, and deciding this property wasn't worth the headache. "We're starting at $800, the auctioneer said, his tone suggesting he didn't expect even that. "Do I have 800? Harold looked at Marge. She was staring at the screen, at that massive house with its broken windows and its decades of neglect. And in her eyes, Harold saw something he hadn't seen in years. Not fear or resignation, but hunger, want. The same thing he felt, looking at that house. This sense that maybe, just maybe, it could be something more than a ruin. Maybe it could be theirs. He raised his paddle. "Number 37. 800, the auctioneer called, barely hiding his surprise. "I've got 800 from the gentleman in back. Do I hear 900? The silence stretched. Harold heard someone behind him whisper, "Why would anyone want that money pit?" Someone else chuckled. 800 going once, the auctioneer said. He paused, looking around the room. Going twice. Another pause. The gavel hovered. Sold to number 37 for $800. The crack of the gavel echoed through Harold's chest like a gunshot. He'd done it. They'd done it. For $800, nearly everything they had, they'd bought a house. A real house. Not an apartment with thin walls and unreliable hot water, but a house with 3 stories, and a tower, and a history. Marge's hand found his under the chairs. She squeezed so hard her arthritic knuckles went white. Harold squeezed back. They signed the papers in a small office that smelled like burnt coffee and photocopier toner. The clerk was a young woman, maybe 30, with bored eyes and perfectly manicured nails that clicked against her keyboard as she typed. She barely looked at Harold and Marge as she processed the sale. "You understand you're buying this as is," she said in a monotone, like she'd said it 1,000 times before. "No warranties, no guarantees. The city gives you 90 days to bring it up to code, or they'll tear it down and bill you for the demolition costs. That could be anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000, so you'll want to work fast." Harold's hand shook as he wrote the check. $800. Their savings. Their cushion. The money that was supposed to last them through the winter and into spring. Gone in one moment. Transformed into a piece of paper that said they owned a condemned house on the edge of town. "Any questions?" the clerk asked. Still not looking at them. "How much to bring it up to code?" Marge asked quietly. The clerk finally glanced up, her expression suggesting this was a stupid question. "Depends on the condition. Could be 50,000. Could be 200. You'll need to hire inspectors, get permits, contract work. It's not going to be cheap. We don't have that kind of money," Harold admitted. The clerk shrugged, already turning back to her computer. "Then you probably shouldn't have bought a condemned house." Next, they drove to Thornhill Road in silence. The Buick, rattling over cracked pavement. The road took them through the older part of Riverside, past houses that had seen better decades, past closed factories and empty lots. The farther they went, the more isolated it became. Streetlights gave way to darkness. Sidewalks crumbled into dirt paths. Thornhill Road was barely paved, more gravel than asphalt. It wound through scrub brush and dying trees, climbing gradually into the hills. No other houses were visible, no signs of neighbors or life. And then, around a final curve, there it was. The Victorian stood alone at the end of the road, silhouetted against the gray November sky. It was bigger than the photo had suggested, massive and imposing. 3 stories of weathered wood and broken glass, the wraparound porch sagging like a tired mouth. The tower rose from one corner, its windows dark and watchful. Paint had long since surrendered to weather, leaving the wood bare and silvered with age. But there was something about it, something in the sharp angles of the roof and the intricate woodwork, still visible beneath decades of neglect, that spoke to Harold. He'd worked with his hands his whole life. First in his father's carpentry shop as a boy, then at the rail yard where precision and attention to detail could mean the difference between safety and disaster. He knew good bones when he saw them. "It's beautiful." Harold looked at his wife, surprised. Beautiful wasn't the word most people would use, but he understood what she meant. Beneath the ruin, beneath the broken windows and sagging porch and 40 years of emptiness, there was something worth saving. Something that had been built with care, with pride, with the expectation that it would endure. They parked the Buick at the end of the overgrown driveway. Their few belongings were packed in the trunk: clothes, kitchen supplies, the air mattress they'd bought at a yard sale, Harold's toolbox. Everything they owned fit in the trunk of a dying car. It should have been depressing, but somehow it felt liberating. They didn't have much, but what they had was theirs. And now they had this house. Harold carried the box of kitchen supplies. Marge had the pillows and blankets. They walked through knee-high weeds toward the front door, their breath fogging in the cold air. Up close, the house was even more imposing. The door was massive oak, carved with intricate designs that had been beautiful once. The brass knob was tarnished but solid. The key the clerk had given them was old, heavy in Harold's palm. It looked like something from another era, ornate and substantial. Harold inserted it into the lock, expecting resistance, expecting rust, and time to have fused the mechanism shut. But the key turned smoothly, almost too smoothly, as if the lock had been maintained. Despite the house's abandonment, the tumblers clicked softly. Harold pushed, and the door swung inward with a long groan of hinges. What lay beyond stole their breath. The foyer soared 2 stories high, crowned by a chandelier that hung dusty and cobwebbed, but still magnificent. It was crystal, or something like it. Hundreds of individual pieces catching the dim light and scattering it across the walls. A curved staircase swept upward to the right, its banister, hand-carved with intricate details, flowers and vines intertwining, and faces, Harold realized with a start. Small faces hidden in the woodwork, peering out from between leaves and petals. The floor was parquet, creating geometric patterns in dark and light wood. It was filthy, covered in decades of dust and dirt, and dead leaves that had blown through broken windows. But beneath the grime, Harold could see the craftsmanship. Each piece of wood had been cut and fitted by hand, creating designs that drew the eye deeper into the house. To the left was a parlor with floor-to-ceiling windows, most still intact though thick with grime. To the right, a formal dining room with built-in china cabinets and crown molding that must have taken months to install. Straight ahead, a hallway led toward what Harold guessed was the kitchen. "This can't be right," Marge whispered. $800 for this? Harold didn't answer because he was thinking the same thing. Something was wrong. Houses like this, even in terrible condition, didn't sell for pocket change. There had to be a reason no one else had bid. A reason this place had sat empty for over 40 years while the city threatened demolition. But they were here now. They'd spent their savings. They had 90 days to make this work, or lose everything. They spent the first hour just exploring. The parlor was stunning, despite its decay. The windows, when Harold scraped away some grime, revealed colored glass borders. The fireplace was marble, real marble, with a mantel carved from a single piece of wood. In the dining room, the chandelier matched the one in the foyer, smaller but equally intricate. The kitchen was a time capsule from the 1970s. Avocado green appliances, Formica countertops, linoleum floor tiles that had yellowed with age. But the bones were solid, deep porcelain sinks, cabinets built from real wood rather than particle board, windows that looked out over what had once been a garden. Upstairs, they found 5 bedrooms, each one larger than their entire apartment. The master bedroom had its own sitting area and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub. The other bedrooms were smaller but still spacious, with closets big enough to walk into. But everywhere they looked, they also found strangeness. In the library, an actual library with floor-to-ceiling built-in bookshelves, one entire wall seemed wrong. The shelves were shallower than the others, the back panel not quite flush. Harold pressed against it, feeling for give, but it was solid. In the dining room, the chandelier wasn't centered over where a table would naturally go. It was offset toward the wall, hanging over empty space. Why would anyone do that? And throughout the house, they kept finding doors that were locked. Not bedroom doors or bathroom doors, but heavy oak doors with deadbolts. Doors that seemed to lead nowhere, that didn't fit the house's layout. Harold tried the key the clerk had given them, but it didn't work on any of these locks. As the afternoon faded into evening, they set up their air mattress in the parlor. The electricity wouldn't be turned on until tomorrow. Harold had arranged it from the library. using their last $50 for the deposit. So they ate dinner by candlelight. Peanut butter sandwiches. Because they hadn't managed to get the gas working yet, and the camping stove was still in the car. "Are we crazy?" Marge asked, her voice small in the vast emptiness of the house. Harold looked at his wife in the candlelight. She looked tired, older than her 73 years, but there was something else in her face too, something he hadn't seen since before the children stopped calling. "Probably," he admitted, "but we've been practical our whole lives. We did everything right, worked hard, raised our kids, saved what we could. And where did it get us? Alone in the apartment we can't afford, taking half doses of medicine, waiting to die." Marge flinched at the bluntness. But she didn't argue. "Maybe it's time to be a little crazy," Harold continued. "Maybe this house is crazy, but it's ours, and that's more than we had yesterday." They lay on the air mattress as darkness settled fully over the house. The sounds of settling wood groaned around them, the old structure adjusting to their presence. Harold lay awake, listening to Marge's breathing beside him, thinking about the locked doors and the strange architecture and the impossibly low price. Something wasn't right here. He could feel it. But whether that something was dangerous or just mysterious, he didn't yet know. Around midnight, he heard it. A soft thump from somewhere below them. Then another. Rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps but too slow, too measured. Harold sat up, heart pounding. Beside him, Marge stirred. "What is it?" Marge stirred. "Shh." He listened. The sounds continued. Thump, pause, thump, pause, coming from beneath the floor, from the basement they hadn't yet explored. "Harold, I'm scared," Marge whispered. He was scared too. But he was also curious, and after a lifetime of playing it safe, of always choosing the careful path, he found that curiosity was stronger. "Stay here," he said, reaching for the flashlight they'd brought. "Don't you dare leave me alone in this house," Marge hissed, already getting up. "Where you go, I go." They moved through the dark house together, the flashlight beam cutting through shadows. The sounds had stopped, but Harold was certain he'd heard them. He wasn't imagining things. Not yet. In the kitchen, he found what he was looking for. A door he'd noticed earlier, tucked into an alcove behind where a refrigerator would normally go. It was heavy oak like the others, but this one had been painted over so many times the knob barely turned. And it was locked, but not with a regular lock. This was a deadbolt, commercial grade, the kind you'd see on a bank vault or a safe room. "This leads to the basement," Harold said, studying the lock. It was newer than the door. Installed maybe 10 or 15 years ago, someone had wanted to keep people out, or keep something in. "Maybe we should leave it alone," Marge suggested, her voice shaking. "Maybe there's a reason it's locked." But Harold was already pulling his tools from his belt. He'd always been good with locks, a skill from his carpentry days. 20 minutes of careful work, and he heard the satisfying click of the deadbolt sliding back. "Harold," Marge said. But she didn't tell him to stop. He gripped the knob and pulled. The door opened onto darkness and stairs descending into black. Cool air rolled out, carrying the smell of concrete and damp earth and something else. Something metallic. Harold shone his flashlight down. The stairs were wood, old but solid. They descended at least 15 feet, deeper than a normal basement should go. "Tomorrow," Marge said firmly. "We explore this tomorrow. In daylight, when we're not exhausted and scared." Harold wanted to argue, wanted to go down those stairs right now and see what was making those sounds. But Marge was right. They were tired. They were scared. And whatever was down there had been waiting 40 years. It could wait one more night. They closed the door but didn't lock it. Harold wedged a chair under the knob instead. If anything came up from below, at least they'd hear it. Back on the air mattress, neither of them slept well. Harold dozed in fits and starts, jerking awake at every creak and groan. Beside him, Marge tossed and turned, her breathing never quite settling into sleep's rhythm. Around 3 in the morning, Harold gave up pretending. He lay staring at the ceiling, at the ornate plaster work that caught shadows from the streetlight outside. He thought about the basement door, about the strange locked rooms throughout the house, about why this place had sold for $800 when it should have been worth hundreds of thousands, even in its current condition. Someone had wanted it empty. Someone had wanted it forgotten. But forgotten things, Harold knew, had a way of demanding to be remembered, and secrets buried deep had a way of clawing back to the surface. As the first grey light of dawn crept through the dirty windows, Harold made a decision. Today, they would open that basement door. Today, they would find out what had been hidden in the house they'd bought with their last dollars. Today, their real exploration would begin. And Harold Patterson, forgotten father and invisible husband, had no idea that what they found beneath those stairs would transform them from 2 elderly people waiting to die into something else entirely. Witnesses, guardians, truth-tellers, people who mattered. Morning came reluctantly to the Victorian house on Thornhill Road, grey light seeping through grime-covered windows like water through a sieve. Harold woke with his back screaming in protest, the air mattress having deflated slightly during the night, leaving him pressed against the hard parlor floor. Every joint ached. Every muscle complained. 74 years old, he thought grimly, was too old to sleep on floors. Beside him, Marge was already awake, sitting up with her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the doorway that led toward the kitchen, toward the basement door. "You heard them too, didn't you?" Harold asked quietly. "The sounds." Marge nodded without looking at him. "I tried to convince myself it was the house settling, old pipes, foundation shifting. But Harold, those were footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing." They sat in silence for a moment, the reality of what they'd bought settling over them heavier than the November cold. This wasn't just an old house with quirky architecture. This was something else. Something that had been kept empty for 40 years, for a reason they didn't yet understand. Harold pushed himself to his feet, joints popping like firecrackers. He walked to the window and looked out over the overgrown yard. In daylight, it looked less ominous, just neglected, not haunted. Weeds had reclaimed what had once been a garden. A fountain sat dry and crumbling in the center of what might have been a circular drive. Beyond the property line, scrub brush and dying trees stretched toward the hills. No neighbors. No other houses visible. Just isolation. "We could leave," Marge said softly. "We could pack up the car, drive back into town, tell the clerk there's been a mistake. Maybe they'd refund our money." Harold turned to look at her. She was still sitting on the deflated air mattress, her silver hair uncombed, her face lined with exhaustion and fear. But her eyes held the same determination he felt. She was offering an escape they both knew neither of them would take. "Or," Harold said, "we could see what's in the basement." Marge smiled, a small, tired thing. "We were never very good at the safe choice. were we? No, Harold agreed. We weren't. They made coffee on the camping stove they'd finally retrieved from the car, weak and bitter but hot enough to burn away some of the night's chill. They ate the other half of yesterday's sandwiches, not talking much, both conserving their energy for whatever came next. When they couldn't delay any longer, when the morning had stretched past 9 and the house seemed to be waiting with them, Harold picked up his flashlight and Marge grabbed the camping lantern, and together they walked to the kitchen. The basement door stood where they'd left it, the chair still wedged under the knob. Nothing had disturbed it during the night, but Harold still approached cautiously, as if something might burst through at any moment. He removed the chair and gripped the doorknob. "Ready?" he asked. Marge moved close beside him, their shoulders touching. "Together," she said. Harold pulled the door open. Beyond it, the wooden stairs descended into darkness, so complete the flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by it. The smell was stronger now in daylight, concrete and damp, and something metallic that made Harold think of old pennies or blood. He took the first step. The wood creaked but held. Marge followed, one hand on his shoulder, the other holding the lantern high. Step by step, they descended into the cold. The basement was vast. As Harold's eyes adjusted and the flashlight beam swept across the space, he realized it extended the full length of the house, maybe 60 feet long and 40 wide. The ceiling was low, maybe 7 feet high, supported by steel I-beams that looked far more industrial than a residential basement should have. The floor was poured concrete, smooth and level, not the rough, cracked surface you'd expect in a basement this old. Against the walls, metal shelving units stood empty, their brackets still bolted in place but holding nothing. In one corner, a workbench sat covered in dust. Tools hung on a pegboard above it, all still there, organized and waiting. A filing cabinet stood beside the workbench, its drawers slightly open, as if someone had left in a hurry. But what caught Harold's attention, what made his breath stop in his throat, was the far wall. Where there should have been concrete or brick, there was steel. A massive steel door, like something from a bank vault, set into a reinforced frame, and beside it, mounted on the wall, a keypad glowed with a soft red light, still powered. After 40 years, something in this house was still connected to electricity. "Sweet Jesus," Marge whispered. "Harold, what is this place?" Harold walked slowly toward the steel door, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. Up close, he could see the door was serious, 6 inches thick at least, with hinges that could support tremendous weight. The keypad beside it was old technology, 1970s or early 80s, but it hummed softly with power. A small LED screen displayed "Locked" in red letters. Harold touched the keypad gently, and it beeped. The screen changed. "Enter combination." "This isn't a house," Harold said, his voice strange and distant even to his own ears. This was some kind of facility. A secure facility. Marge had moved to the filing cabinet. She pulled open the top drawer fully, flashlight beam revealing manila folders, dozens of them, all carefully labeled. She pulled one out at random, opened it. "Harold," she said, her voice shaking, "you need to see this." Inside the folder were documents, official-looking forms, with government seals, typed reports, black and white photographs of men in suits. The photos were surveillance style, taken from a distance, the subjects unaware they were being watched. Marge flipped to the next page. A typed report labeled "Subject Observation Log, Operation Gladstone." Harold took the folder from her with numb fingers. He read the first paragraph. Subject departed residence at 0700 hours. Proceeded to downtown location as expected. Contact established at 0900 hours. With subject 2. Exchange observed but audio surveillance unsuccessful due to environmental interference. Recommend enhanced equipment for future operations. This was a surveillance house, Harold said. Someone was running operations from here. Government operations. They spent the next hour going through the filing cabinet. Every drawer was full. Operation Gladstone. Operation Perplex. Operation Mongoose. Names that meant nothing to Harold but were clearly code names for something serious. Something classified. The dates ranged from 1972 to 1981. 9 years of surveillance, observation, operations. And then, in the bottom drawer, Harold found the journal. It was leather-bound, hand-sized, worn smooth from handling. No label, no indication of what it contained. Harold opened it carefully, the pages brittle with age. The first entry was dated June 14, 1972. Received authorization for home base establishment. Location confirmed. Thornhill property. Will begin modifications immediately. Mission parameters. Secure asset storage for operations Gladstone, Perplex, and Mongoose. Eyes. Only classification. No paper trail beyond this record. God help me. I hope I'm doing the right thing. Harold flipped through the pages. Hundreds of entries, written in a tight, precise hand. Some were brief operational notes. Others were longer, more personal, revealing a man's growing fear and paranoia. October 3, 1975. Another delivery tonight. $8.2 million in unmarked bills. Source: Gladstone Recovery, Caribbean Theatre. Asset count now exceeds 47 million. Director assures, operational security remains absolute. I'm less certain. The money comes in, but never leaves. What are we really doing here? Harold's hands began to shake. $8.2 million. $47 million. Asset storage. This wasn't just surveillance. This house had been used to hide money. Massive amounts of money. He kept reading. Jumping ahead through the years. March 19, 1978. Mongoose operation terminated. All personnel reassigned or retired. My requests for clarification ignored. Asset total now exceeds 156 million. No retrieval orders received. Beginning to question directive structure. Who authorized this? Where does the money ultimately go? Mitchell says I'm paranoid. But Mitchell wasn't there when they closed. Perplex. He didn't see what happened to the men who asked too many questions. Marge had been reading over his shoulder. She pointed to another entry, her finger trembling. There. January 7, 1981. Harold read aloud. Mitchell died yesterday. Officially, heart attack. But Mitchell was 42 and ran marathons. He was asking questions. Same questions I've been asking. Someone came to his funeral, man I didn't recognize. Expensive suit. Watched from a distance. Afterward, I saw the same car parked on my street. I'm being watched. I can feel it. The final entry was dated September 9, 1981. They're coming. I saw the surveillance van on Thornhill this morning. Same one from Mitchell's neighborhood the day before he died. I'm sealing the vault tonight and destroying all connecting documentation. If you're reading this, I failed to expose the truth. I pray you succeed where I could not. The money belongs to the people. Don't let them bury it again. Trust no one in federal service. The corruption goes to the highest levels. The combination is in the music. Trust the melody, not the key. T. W. Harold closed the journal slowly. His heart was hammering. Marge had gone pale. One hand pressed to her chest. "Who was T.W.?" she asked. "I don't know. But he sealed the vault, and he left this journal for whoever found it." Harold looked at the steel door across the basement. "The money's in there. Has to be. And he left us instructions on how to open it. The combination is in the music." Marge repeated. "What? Music?" They searched the basement thoroughly, but found nothing. No musical instruments, no sheet music, nothing that could be the music the journal mentioned. The rest of the filing cabinet held more operational reports, surveillance logs, photographs, evidence of whatever these operations had been, but no music. "It has to be somewhere else in the house," Harold said. "Come on." They climbed back up the wooden stairs, Harold's mind racing. Music. Trust the melody, not the key. It was a clue, a puzzle, something T.W. had left behind to protect the vault while still giving someone trustworthy a chance to open it. They searched systematically. The parlor yielded nothing. The dining room, the kitchen, the library. In each room, they looked for anything musical instruments, sheet music, even old record albums. Nothing. It was on the second floor, in what must have been the master bedroom, that Marge found it. The room was large, dominated by a 4-poster bed frame that had been left behind. Wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing plaster beneath. A door led to a private bathroom with a clawfoot tub. But what caught Marge's attention was another door, one that had been hidden behind a fallen bookshelf. Harold helped her move the bookshelf. It was lighter than expected, hollow, as if it had been made specifically to be moved. Behind it, the door was smaller than others in the house. Maybe 5 feet tall. Harold had to duck to enter. Beyond was a room they hadn't known existed. A hidden room, accessed only through the master bedroom. It was small, perhaps 10 feet by 10, with no windows. A desk built into the wall, shelves above it, a single chair, and on the wall opposite the desk, someone had drawn directly on the plaster, with what looked like black marker, staff lines, musical notation, a simple melody, 5 notes that repeated, E, G, B, D, F. Beneath it, written in that same precise hand from the journal, "Every good boy deserves favor." Marge's breath caught. It's a mnemonic for remembering musical notes on the treble clef. The lines E, G, B, D, F. "But the notes are wrong," Harold said, studying the drawn staff. "They're not in the right order. They're scrambled." He pulled out the journal again, flipping through until he found a page he'd seen earlier but not fully processed. There, written in the margin, changed combination again. September 8, 1979. Starting sequence, F6, D, 3B, 8E, 2G, 4. Asset must remain secure until proper authorities contacted. But who can I trust? "That's it," Harold said, his hands shaking with excitement. "The musical notes are the letters F, D, B, E, G. F6, D3. Byte, E2. G4. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then, without speaking, they both turned and headed back down to the basement. Harold stood before the keypad, the journal open in Marge's hands beside him. His finger hovered over the keys. This was it. Whatever T.W. had sealed away 43 years ago, whatever had driven him into hiding and possibly to his death, was on the other side of this door. "Are you sure about this?" Marge asked. Harold thought about the question. Was he sure? No. He wasn't sure about anything. But they'd come this far. They'd spent their last dollars on this house. They'd found evidence of government operations and hidden money, and a man so terrified he'd spent years documenting his own paranoia. They couldn't turn back now. I'm sure, Harold said. He pressed the keys. 6. The keypad beeped softly. D3. Another beep. Bait. E2. G4. For a moment, nothing happened. Harold's heart sank. Had he gotten it wrong? Had the combination changed? Or had he misunderstood the clue? Then, deep in the walls, something mechanical groaned to life. Heavy bolts slid back with metallic thuds. The red LED screen changed from locked to open. The steel door shifted, just an inch. Just enough to show it was no longer sealed. Harold gripped the handle, a thick metal bar that required both hands, and pulled. The door swung outward with surprising smoothness, as if it had been maintained, oiled, kept ready despite decades of disuse. Beyond it, motion sensor lights flickered on, revealing a room about 15 feet square, and inside that room, stacked neatly on industrial metal shelving, were boxes, dozens of them, hundreds. Harold stepped inside, Marge close behind him. The boxes were uniform, heavy-duty plastic containers with secure lids, the kind designed for long-term storage. Each was labeled with dates and codes: G, S197508A, P, P197703B, M, G, 198012C. Harold approached the nearest shelf. His hands trembled as he lifted down one of the boxes. It was heavy, surprisingly so. He set it on the metal table that occupied the center of the room and lifted the lid. Money. Stacks and stacks of $100 bills, bundled with paper bands marked $10,000. Each band pristine, each bill crisp and new despite its age. Harold counted 12 bundles in this box alone. $120,000. In a single box. He looked at Marge. She had gone pale, her hand pressed to her mouth. Harold turned to the shelving, really seeing it now. 3 walls of shelving, 7 shelves high on each wall, and every shelf packed with boxes. "Oh my God," Marge whispered. "Harold, how much is here?" Harold's mind struggled with the math. If each box held the same amount, and there had to be at least 200 boxes, he couldn't calculate it. The number was too large, too incomprehensible. He opened another box. More money, different denominations, $50 bills this time. Another box held what looked like bearer bonds, official documents with seals and signatures, each one worth thousands. A fourth box contained gold coins in plastic sleeves, gleaming even in the fluorescent light. Against the far wall stood a filing cabinet, different from the one upstairs. Harold opened it with numb fingers. Inside were more folders. But these were different, not surveillance reports, but transaction records. Every deposit documented, every bundle of cash accounted for, every bond and coin catalogued with clinical precision. Harold pulled a folder at random. Inside was a detailed record from March 1977. Deposit: $3.2 million in cash. Source: transaction 847B. Pursuant to federal arrangement. Official recovery amount: $1.8 million. Discrepancy: $1.4 million. Secured per operational directive. He grabbed another folder. Same pattern. Official amounts that didn't match actual deposits. Money that had been skimmed, stolen, redirected. For 9 years, Someone had been running operations, recovering funds, and then hiding a portion of those funds in this house. And T.W., whoever he was, had documented every single discrepancy. "This isn't just money," Harold said, his voice strange and hollow. "This is evidence. Evidence of fraud, government fraud." Marge had opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. She pulled out a thick manila envelope, marked "Instructions," read first. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter, typed on an old typewriter, the keys having struck unevenly into yellowed paper. "What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power." Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Marge read the letter aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "To whoever finds this, my name is Thomas Whitmore. I was a federal agent for 26 years, assigned to coordinate certain operations that required discretion beyond normal channels. This house was a secure facility, authorized at the highest levels, but never officially documented. What you found is the result of operations conducted between 1972 and 1980. I cannot explain more without risking both our lives. In 1981, I learned that elements within the agency had been compromised. I sealed this vault and disappeared. I intended to contact proper authorities, but never found anyone I could trust. If you've opened this door, then I am likely dead. The money was never meant to stay hidden. It belongs to the people, held in trust until it could be safely returned. But I warn you, there are people who know this house exists, who have been watching it for decades. If they learn you've found this room, they will come, not to talk, not to negotiate. These are not good people. They will do whatever is necessary to keep this secret buried. You have 3 choices. Seal this door, forget what you saw, and live your life. Take the money and disappear, though they may find you eventually. Or do what I could not find someone trustworthy in law enforcement or government and expose the truth. I pray you choose more wisely than I did, and I pray you survive the choice. The total asset value, as of my last inventory in August 1981, was approximately $187 million. By now, with interest and appreciation, it could be worth significantly more. This money was stolen from the American people through fraud and corruption. It should be returned to them, but only if you can do so safely. Trust no one in federal service. The corruption goes to the highest levels. I'm sorry to leave you with this burden. Thomas J. Whitmore. Badge 2847. September 9, 1981. The letter fell from Marge's hands, drifting to the concrete floor. Harold stood frozen, unable to process what he'd just heard. $187 million. Maybe more by now. Money that had been stolen, hidden, forgotten for 43 years. And now it was theirs, or at least, they were the ones who'd found it. "We need to count it," Harold said finally, because he didn't know what else to say. They spent the next 6 hours in that vault. Harold methodically opened every box, while Marge recorded the contents in one of the blank ledgers they found on a shelf. Box after box revealed the same pattern. Cash in various denominations, bearer bonds, gold coins, even some jewelry and diamonds that must have been seized in operations. The numbers grew incomprehensible. 4 million here, 6 million there, 10 million in bonds, $2 million in gold. By the time they'd catalogued the final box, as the November darkness gathered outside and their camping lantern began to flicker, Marge added up the columns 3 times to be sure. "Harold," she said, her voice strange and distant, "it's just over $212 million. $212 million. Harold sat down hard on the concrete floor, his 74-year-old bones protesting. He thought about the $800 they'd paid for this house, about the apartment above the laundromat where they'd rationed food and medicine, about their children who couldn't be bothered to call. $212 million. "What do we do?" Marge asked. Harold looked up at his wife. She stood in the harsh fluorescent light of the vault, surrounded by evidence of massive corruption. Her arthritis-twisted hands holding a ledger that documented more money than they could spend in 100 lifetimes. And in her eyes, he saw the same question he was feeling. What did they do? Thomas Whitmore had warned them people were watching this house. Dangerous people. People who had already killed to keep this secret buried. If Harold and Marge exposed this, they'd become targets. They'd spend whatever time they had left looking over their shoulders, waiting for someone to silence them the way they'd silenced Whitmore and his friend Mitchell. But if they took the money, if they tried to disappear with it, the same people would find them eventually. 2 elderly people suddenly living beyond their means. That would attract attention faster than anything. And if they sealed the vault and walked away, if they pretended they'd never found it, then what? Back to the apartment? Back to half doses of medicine and counting pennies? Back to being forgotten? "I don't know," Harold admitted. "But we need to think about this carefully. This isn't just about us anymore." They sealed the vault door and climbed back upstairs. The house felt different now, heavier somehow, as if it were pressing down on them with the weight of its secrets. They ate dinner in silence, canned soup heated on the camping stove, neither of them able to articulate what they were feeling. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He lay on the deflated air mattress, listening to Marge's breathing beside him, thinking about Thomas Whitmore and the journal and the warning. Around midnight, he heard it again, that sound from the night before. A car engine, idling somewhere nearby. Harold got up quietly and went to the window. He pulled back a corner of the board covering the broken pane and looked out. A dark sedan sat at the end of their driveway, headlights off, barely visible in the darkness. Just sitting there, watching. Harold's blood ran cold. Whitmore had been right. Someone was watching. Someone had always been watching. And now that Harold and Marge had moved in, now that they'd found the vault, whoever was out there knew. They knew. The sedan idled for another 5 minutes, then slowly drove away. No lights, no sound except the soft rumble of its engine, fading into the night. Harold returned to the air mattress, his hands shaking. Marge was awake. He realized. She'd been listening too. "They're watching us," he whispered. "I know," Marge replied. "So, what do we do?" Harold thought about that question, really thought about it. They could run, pack up the Buick in the morning, take some money from the vault, and disappear. Change their names, move somewhere remote, spend their remaining years looking over their shoulders. They could seal the vault and pretend. Live in this house, fix it up somehow, and never speak of what they'd found. Let the secret die with them, the way it had nearly died with Whitmore. Or they could do what Whitmore had asked. Find someone they could trust if such a person existed and expose the truth. $212 million stolen from the American people. Decades of corruption. A conspiracy that had killed at least 1 man. Maybe more. We expose it," Harold said finally. "Not tomorrow," Not until we understand what we're dealing with. But we expose it. That's what Whitmore wanted. That's what's right. Marge was quiet for a long moment. Then her hand found his in the darkness. We could die for this, Harold. You understand that? These people, they've already killed. They won't hesitate to kill 2 more. I know, Harold said. But Marge, we're already dying. Every day in that apartment, eating rice and beans, rationing medicine, pretending we don't exist, that was dying. At least this way. We die for something. We die mattering. He felt Marge's grip tighten. Then we do it together, she said. Whatever happens, we face it together. Together. Harold agreed. They lay in the darkness, hands clasped, while outside their condemned Victorian house, with its impossible secret, someone watched and waited. And Harold thought about Thomas Whitmore, dead for over 20 years, finally getting his wish. Someone had found his evidence. Someone had opened his vault, and someone, 2 forgotten people who had nothing left to lose, was going to make sure his sacrifice meant something. The truth was coming. And after 43 years in the dark, it was going to burn like sunlight. Harold just hoped they'd live long enough to see it. The morning after they'd opened the vault, Harold woke to find Marge already dressed, sitting at the card table they'd set up in the parlor, writing in a notebook with careful, deliberate strokes. The camping lantern cast her shadow long against the wall, making her look both fragile and monumental at once. Making a list, she said without looking up. Everything we need to figure out who Thomas Whitmore really was, who we can trust, how to verify the money is real, what the legal implications are, whether we're breaking any laws just by having it. Harold poured himself coffee from the thermos they'd made it at the gas station down the road, their camping stove having finally given up entirely. That's a long list. It's going to get longer. Marge finally looked at him, and Harold saw something in her face he hadn't seen in years. Determination. Purpose. The same look she'd worn when she was raising 3 children on his rail yard salary, making every dollar stretch, refusing to let poverty define them. We need help, Harold. Professional help. A lawyer, maybe. Someone who understands this kind of thing. Whitmore said to trust no one in federal service, Harold reminded her. He said that in 1981, 43 years ago. The people involved then are probably dead or retired by now. Maybe things have changed. Harold wanted to believe that. But the memory of that dark sedan idling at the end of their driveway, waiting, that memory suggested otherwise. They decided to start with research. Harold drove to the public library that afternoon, using their last tank of gas, while Marge stayed at the house. They'd agreed not to leave it empty. Not now that they knew what it contained. The library had computers and internet access, things Harold barely understood but knew he needed to learn. The librarian, a kind woman named Patricia who looked to be in her 50s, helped him navigate the search engine. "What are you looking for?" she asked. "Information about a federal agent," Harold said carefully. "Thomas Whitmore. He would have worked sometime between the 1970s and 1980s. Patricia showed him how to type the name into the search box, how to filter results. Harold worked slowly, hunt and peck typing with his index fingers, but eventually he found something. An obituary from March 1997. Thomas J. Whitmore, 71, passed away at Riverside Memorial Hospital following a prolonged illness. Mr. Whitmore served in federal law enforcement for 26 years before his retirement in 1981. He is survived by a daughter, Patricia Whitmore Chen, of Portland, Oregon. Services private. Harold stared at the screen. Prolonged illness. The phrase felt deliberately vague, meaningless. Whitmore had been terrified in those final journal entries, convinced someone was coming for him. And 16 years after he'd sealed the vault, he'd died of prolonged illness? Harold didn't believe in coincidences. Not anymore, but there was a daughter, Patricia Whitmore Chen, in Portland, Oregon. Harold wrote down the name carefully, then searched for more information about the operations Whitmore had mentioned. Gladstone, Perplex, Mongoose. He found nothing. No declassified documents, no historical records, no mention of these code names anywhere in the public record. It was as if they'd never existed. As if 9 years of federal operations had been completely erased from history. Harold drove back to the house as the afternoon light began to fade, his mind churning. When he pulled into the driveway, he immediately noticed something wrong. A car he didn't recognize, a new Tesla, sleek and expensive, was parked near the front porch. His heart began to pound. Had someone come? Had the watchers decided to make their move? Harold hurried to the front door. But before he could get his key in the lock, it opened. And standing there, looking irritated and impatient, was his oldest son, Michael. "Dad," Michael said, "where the hell have you been? We've been waiting for over an hour." Harold's mouth went dry. "Michael? What are you doing here? Can I come in? Or are you going to make me stand on the porch?" Michael pushed past, without waiting for an answer, and Harold saw 2 other figures in the parlor beyond. Sarah, his daughter, talking on her cell phone, and Daniel, his youngest, sitting on the floor because they had no furniture yet. All 3 of his children, together, for the first time in over a decade. Harold stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind him. Marge stood in the doorway to the kitchen, her face pale, her hands clasped together like she was praying or preparing for a blow. "What's going on?" Harold asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Sarah ended her phone call and turned, her expression a mixture of concern and frustration. "What's going on? Dad, you bought a house? A condemned house? We had to hear about it from some reporter who called asking questions about your mental state." "Reporter?" Harold's stomach dropped. "Rachel Odom," Michael said, pulling out his phone and showing Harold a business card from the Riverside Tribune. "She called Sarah 3 days ago, said she was doing a story on the property, and wanted to know if we had concerns about our elderly parents taking on such a massive renovation project. She implied, pretty heavily implied, that maybe you weren't thinking clearly." Harold's mind raced. Rachel Odom, the same reporter who'd come to their door that first week, asking questions about the house and its history. He'd given her his card, told her he'd think about an interview. He'd thought she was just a journalist, looking for a human interest story, but she'd called his children. She'd planted seeds of doubt about his competence, his judgment. Why would a reporter do that, unless she wasn't really a reporter? Unless she was working for whoever was watching the house. "You shouldn't be here," Harold said quietly. Michael laughed. A short, sharp sound. "Shouldn't be here? Dad, look at this place. You're living in squalor. No heat. No working kitchen. Sleeping on an air mattress on the floor like you're camping. You spent your last dollars on a house you can't possibly afford to fix up." Sarah's right to be concerned. "We didn't ask for your concern," Marge said, her voice stronger than Harold expected. "We certainly didn't invite you here." Daniel finally spoke up from his spot on the floor. "Mom, we're worried about you. Both of you. This house, he gestured around at the peeling wallpaper. The dusty chandelier, the broken windows covered with plywood. It's not safe. The city's going to condemn it anyway. You'll lose everything. We already lost everything, Harold said. Where were you when we were living in that apartment? When your mother was taking half doses of her medication? When I sold my wedding ring just to keep the car running? An uncomfortable silence fell. Michael's jaw tightened. Sarah looked away. Daniel stared at his boots. We're here now, Michael finally said. And we want to help. Sarah found a buyer. Harold's blood went cold. What? A buyer? Sarah said, pulling papers from her purse. For the house. He's offering $50,000 cash, as is. That's way more than you paid, and way more than this place is worth. It's a good deal, Dad. You could take that money, get into a nice assisted living facility. We're not selling. Marge interrupted. Mom, be reasonable. I said we're not selling. Marge's voice cracked like a whip, and all three children flinched. Harold had never heard his wife speak that way, with such absolute authority. This is our house. We bought it. We're keeping it. And what we do with it is none of your business. Michael's face flushed red. None of our business? You're our parents. We have a responsibility. None of our business. None of our business. None of our business. Responsibility. Harold felt something breaking loose inside him, something that had been compressed and contained for too long. You want to talk about responsibility? You haven't called in 2 years, Michael. 2 years. Sarah, you live 40 minutes away, and we've seen you exactly 3 times in the last decade. Daniel, we didn't even know if you were alive until you showed up here today. Dad, Daniel started. No. Harold's voice was shaking now, but not with fear, with fury, with decades of swallowed disappointment and dismissed pain, finally finding release. You don't get to show up here after years of silence and pretend you're concerned. You're not here because you care. You're here because someone called and told you maybe there was something in it for you. That's not fair, Sarah protested, but her voice was weak. Fair? Marge laughed, a bitter sound Harold had never heard from her before. You want to talk about fair? Where were you when we needed you? When I was choosing between medicine and groceries? When your father was working 12-hour shifts at 70 years old just so we could make rent? We didn't know. Michael began. You didn't ask, Harold said. You didn't want to know, because knowing would have meant responsibility. It would have meant caring, and that was too inconvenient for your lives, wasn't it? The silence that followed was crushing. Michael's expensive suit suddenly looked garish in the shabby parlor. Sarah's designer handbag seemed obscene next to the card table and camping lantern. Daniel, at least, had the grace to look ashamed. Look, Michael said finally, his voice tight. We're not here to fight. We're here because we care. You're here because Rachel Odom called you, Harold interrupted. Tell me, how did she know to call you? We haven't spoken in years. How did she even know who you were or how to reach you? Michael hesitated. And in that hesitation, Harold saw the answer. She already knew, Harold continued. She had your numbers ready. She knew exactly who to call and what to say to get you here. This whole thing, the concern about our mental state, the buyer who's ready to pay cash, it's all orchestrated. Dad? That's paranoid. Is it? Harold walked to the window and pulled back the board covering it. You see that street out there? Every night since we moved in, a black sedan drives by, slowly, watching. Last night it sat at the end of our driveway for 10 minutes. Just sitting there. So, no, Michael. I don't think I'm being paranoid. I think someone very much wants us out of this house, and they're using you to make it happen. Sarah's face had gone pale. What are you saying? I'm saying this house has secrets, Marge said quietly. Secrets that powerful people want to stay hidden, and we're not leaving until we expose them. What kind of secrets? Daniel asked. Harold looked at his children, these 3 people he'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who'd abandoned him the moment he stopped being useful. Could he trust them? Should he trust them? No. The answer came clearly, painfully. He couldn't. They'd proven that already. That's none of your concern, Harold said. The house is ours. The secrets are ours. And we're asking you to leave. Dad. Sarah. Tried. Again. Leave, Marge repeated. Now. And don't come back unless you're ready to treat us like people, not problems to be solved or deals to be made. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Michael shoved his phone into his pocket, his face red with anger or embarrassment, or both. Fine. We tried to help. But when this place collapses around you, when the city condemns it, and you're left with nothing, don't call us. We won't, Harold said. We stopped expecting anything from you a long time ago. Michael stormed out, his expensive shoes loud on the wooden porch. Sarah hesitated, tears in her eyes. Mom, I'm sorry. I should have been better. I should have. You should have. Marge agreed. But you weren't. And right now, we can't trust that you're not here for the wrong reasons. Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes, and followed Michael out. Daniel remained a moment longer. I really am sorry, he said quietly, for all of it, for disappearing, for not being there. Then prove it, Harold said. By leaving us alone, by not coming back with lawyers or social workers, or whatever your brother's planning next. Daniel nodded once, then walked out, closing the door softly behind him. Harold and Marge stood in the sudden silence of the empty house. Through the window, they watched the Tesla and the other cars pull away, taillights disappearing down Thornhill Road. Then Marge began to cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Harold pulled her close, feeling his own eyes burn. That was our children, Marge gasped between sobs. Our babies. And we just threw them out. I know, Harold whispered. I know. But even as he held her, even as his heart broke for what they'd just done, Harold knew it had been necessary. Their children hadn't come out of love. They'd come because someone, that reporter, or whoever she really worked for, had manipulated them into coming, had used their indifference, their casual cruelty, as a weapon against Harold and Marge. And Harold refused to be a victim anymore. Refused to let Marge be diminished or dismissed, or treated like her choices didn't matter. They'd stood up. Maybe for the first time in decades they'd stood up and said, "We matter. Our lives matter. Our choices matter." It had cost them their children. But Harold was beginning to suspect they'd lost their children years ago. They were just now admitting it. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the confrontation, kept seeing Michael's angry face, and Sarah's tears, and Daniel's shame. He thought about the years of silence, the birthdays that passed without cards, the holidays spent alone, while his children built lives that didn't include him. When had it started? When had they stopped being a family and become strangers? Maybe at his retirement party, when they'd barely stayed an hour, or maybe earlier, when Michael had announced his engagement and Harold and Marge hadn't been invited to meet the fiancé beforehand. Or maybe it had been gradual, a slow erosion so subtle they hadn't noticed, until the foundation was gone. Around 2 in the morning, Harold heard the car again. The black sedan, idling at the end of the driveway. He went to the window and looked out. This time, someone got out. A man in an expensive suit, tall and lean, moving with the confidence of someone who expected the world to bend to his will. He didn't come to the door. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at the house, looking at Harold in the window. Even though it should have been too dark to see him, the man smiled. Then he got back in the car and drove away. Harold's blood ran cold. It was a message. We know you're there. We know you're not leaving. And we're not going away either. The next morning, Harold made a decision. He needed legal advice, and he needed it from someone outside Riverside. Someone who couldn't be connected to whatever corruption Whitmore had uncovered. He drove 3 towns over to a strip mall that advertised Wilson and Associates, attorneys at law. The office was modest, a few rooms above a dry cleaner. The receptionist was a teenager, probably the lawyer's kid working after school. But when Harold met James Wilson, he found a sharp-eyed man in his 60s who listened carefully as Harold explained vaguely that he'd inherited some property with complicated ownership issues. How complicated? Wilson asked. Very, Harold said. There's money involved. A lot of money. And I need to know what my legal obligations are. Wilson leaned back in his chair. Are we talking about found money? Like, discovered on the property? Yes. And you don't know who it belongs to, or how it got there. I have some documentation, but it's old. 40+ years old. Wilson whistled low. Mr. Patterson, if you've found substantial assets on property you legally own, there are regulations about that. You need to report it, especially if it might be connected to criminal activity. Failure to report could make you an accessory, even if I didn't put it there. Even if I didn't know about it when I bought the property. Even then. Though there are nuances. If you can prove you acquired the property legally, without knowledge of the assets, and if you report the discovery promptly, you might be protected. But Wilson leaned forward. And this is important if someone comes forward claiming ownership. Things get complicated. What if the people claiming ownership are criminals? Harold asked. What if the money was stolen? Wilson's eyes sharpened. Then you definitely need to report it to federal authorities. FBI. Probably. Or Treasury. Depending on the nature of the theft. Mr. Patterson. Exactly how much money are we talking about here? Harold hesitated. Then, over $200 million. Wilson's face went slack. For a long moment, he just stared. Then, get out. Wilson's face. The Mostins. Wilson's face. Wilson's face. What? Out of my office. Right now. Wilson stood up, his face pale. I don't know what you're involved in, but I want no part of it. $200 million doesn't just appear. That's cartel money. Or terrorism. Or something worse. And I'm not ending up dead because I gave legal advice to the wrong person. I bought a house, Harold protested, at a legal auction for $800, and I found this money hidden in the basement. I haven't stolen anything. I don't care, Wilson interrupted. You need a lawyer who specializes in federal crimes, asset forfeiture, maybe even national security. I handle divorces and DUIs. This is so far beyond my expertise it might as well be on the moon. Now, please leave before someone sees you here. Harold left. his heart sinking. If a small-town lawyer was too scared to even discuss it, what did that say about the danger they were in? He drove back toward Thornhill Road, but halfway there, he noticed a car following him. Not the black sedan, this was a grey SUV with tinted windows. It stayed 3 cars back, matching his speed perfectly. Harold's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He took a sudden right turn, then another. The SUV followed. He pulled into a grocery store parking lot. The SUV drove past, but Harold saw it circle back and park across the street. They weren't even hiding it anymore. They were making sure Harold knew he was being watched. Harold bought some supplies at the grocery store. Canned food, bread, coffee, taking his time, trying to think. When he came out, the SUV was gone. But as he drove home, he spotted it again in his rear-view mirror. At the house, Marge was waiting with news of her own. "Someone from the city came by," she said, her voice shaking. "Building inspector. He left this." She handed Harold an official document. Notice of violation. The house had been inspected without their permission, while Marge was in the bathroom and hadn't heard the knock, and found to have numerous code violations. They had 30 days to address them or face immediate demolition. 30 days. Harold read. "They cut our time in half. We were supposed to have 90. He said the violations were worse than expected." Marge said. "He said the house is a danger to public safety, and they're expediting the process." Harold crumpled the notice in his fist. It was all connected. The reporter calling their children. The lawyer too scared to help. The car following him. And now the city suddenly finding the house so dangerous it needed immediate action. They were being squeezed from every direction. Pressured to leave, to give up, to walk away from what they'd found. "We need help," Harold said. "Real help. From someone who knows how to handle this." "Who?" Marge asked. "Who can we trust? Who can we trust?" Harold thought about Whitmore's journal, about the daughter in Portland, Patricia Whitmore Chen. She might know something. She might be able to point them towards someone her father had trusted. "I need to make a phone call," Harold said. He drove back to the payphone outside the convenience store, the same one he'd used before. This time, he made sure no one was following. He called information for Portland, Oregon, got a number for Patricia Whitmore Chen. A woman answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello, is this Patricia Whitmore Chen?" A pause. "Who's calling?" "My name is Harold Patterson. I bought your father's house in Thornhill." The silence stretched so long Harold thought she'd hung up. Then, very quietly, "That house was supposed to be demolished." "It almost was," Harold said. "But my wife and I bought it 2 weeks ago, and you found something." Again. Not a question. Harold's throat tightened. "Yes, ma'am. We found something." Another long pause. "Mr. Patterson, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. Whatever you found in that house, forget about it. Seal it back up. Walk away. My father spent 16 years in hiding because of what was in that house. He died, terrified, paranoid, convinced someone was coming for him, and you know what? He was right. So if you value your life, if you value your wife's life, you'll leave right now and never go back." "Your father left a letter," Harold said. "He asked whoever found it to expose the truth. He said the money belonged to the people." "The money," Patricia's voice cracked, "killed him. Not officially. Officially it was cancer. But the stress, the fear, the years of running, that's what really killed him. And it'll kill you too if you're not careful." "Ma'am, please. We need help. We don't know what to do or who to trust. Your father must have had someone, some friend." "He had one," Patricia interrupted. "One person he believed in. Marcus Webb. They went through the academy together. Dad said, if anyone ever found what he'd been protecting, I should contact Webb. Said he'd know what to do. Where can I find him? Last I heard, he'd retired from the FBI, moved to the Inspector General's office, then retired from that too. Lives somewhere in Virginia now. Chesapeake Bay area, I think. But Mr. Patterson," her voice dropped even lower, "if you do find him, be very, very careful. My father trusted people, and that's what destroyed him. Trust was his weakness. Don't make the same mistake." The line went dead. Harold stood in the phone booth, processing what he'd learned. Marcus Webb, former FBI, then Inspector General, lives in Virginia. It was something, a thread he could pull. But Patricia's warning echoed in his mind. Her father had trusted people, and it had gotten him killed. Could Harold trust Marcus Webb? He drove back to the house, watching his mirrors constantly. The gray SUV didn't reappear, but that didn't mean he wasn't being watched. They had other cars, other people. They were patient. They could wait. At the house, he found Marge sitting on the front porch, despite the cold, wrapped in blankets, staring at the overgrown garden. When she heard the Buick, she stood up. "Harold," she said, and something in her voice made him hurry toward her. "Harold," Sarah called. His heart sank. To apologize. Really apologize, not just words. She said she's been thinking about what you said, about how we've been abandoned. She said she wants to make it right. "Marge, I know," Marge interrupted. "I know we can't trust her motives. I know she might be working with whoever's watching us. But Harold, she's our daughter. What if she's genuine?" Harold looked at his wife. This woman, who'd stood beside him for over 50 years, who'd faced poverty and neglect and heartbreak with quiet strength. And he saw in her face the same thing he felt. The desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, one of their children actually cared. It was their weakness. The same weakness that had destroyed Thomas Whitmore. "We can't let them in," Harold said gently. "Not yet. Not until we know it's safe. Not until we know they're here for the right reasons." Marge nodded, tears in her eyes. "I know. But it hurts, Harold. It hurts so much." "I know." They stood on the porch of their condemned house, holding each other against the November cold and the weight of impossible choices. Below their feet, $200 million waited in a sealed vault. Around them, invisible eyes watched and waited for them to make a mistake. And somewhere in Virginia, a man named Marcus Webb might hold the key to surviving what came next. If they could find him. If they could trust him. If they lived long enough to try. Harold held Marge tighter and made a promise to himself. Whatever happened, whoever came for them, he wouldn't let them break her. Wouldn't let them take away the strength and dignity she'd reclaimed in this strange, dangerous house. They'd been forgotten for too long. Dismissed for too long. Treated like they didn't matter for too long. Now they had something that mattered. Evidence of corruption. Proof of crimes. A truth that powerful people had killed to keep hidden. And Harold Patterson, 74-year-old former rail yard worker, invisible father and dismissed husband, was going to make damn sure that truth saw daylight, even if it killed him. Especially if it killed him, because at least then he'd die mattering. Finding Marcus Webb took Harold 3 days of careful searching. He used computers at different libraries, never the same one twice. Always paying cash for printouts. Always watching to see if he was followed. The grey SUV appeared twice more. And once he spotted the black sedan parked outside a library in a town 40 miles from Riverside. They were watching. Always watching. But Harold was learning to be careful. Learning to think like someone with something to protect. It was strange, this transformation. For decades, he'd been invisible. Someone the world looked through rather than at. Now he felt hypervisible, aware of every glance, every car that stayed too long, every coincidence that might not be coincidence. He finally found Marcus Webb through an archived article about Inspector General investigations from the late 1990s. Webb had been quoted, his title listed, and a follow-up article from 2005 mentioned his retirement. Harold cross-referenced that with property records, thank God for the internet and public databases, and found an address in Chesapeake Bay, Virginia. He didn't call. Phone lines couldn't be trusted. Instead, he wrote a letter by hand, his penmanship shaky but determined. Mr. Webb, my name is Harold Patterson. I recently acquired property at 847 Thornhill Road that once belonged to Thomas Whitmore. I've discovered certain materials Mr. Whitmore left behind, including his journal and extensive documentation of Operations Gladstone, Perplex, and Mongoose. His daughter Patricia suggested you might be the right person to contact. If you're willing to speak with me, please respond to the enclosed P.O. Box number. If I don't hear from you within 2 weeks, I'll assume you're unable or unwilling to help, and I'll find another path forward. Time is critical. We're being watched. Respectfully, Harold Patterson. He mailed it from a post office 3 towns over, paying cash for the P.O. box under a false name, something else he'd learned to do in the past 2 weeks. Then he and Marge waited. While they waited, something shifted in Harold. He spent hours each night in the vault, reading through Whitmore's meticulous documentation. The files told stories not just of money moved and operations conducted, but of lives affected. People whose assets had been seized, sometimes legitimately, sometimes not. Families destroyed by corruption they didn't understand and couldn't fight. One file stuck with him. A Cuban family in Miami whose restaurant had been raided in 1976. Official records showed $12,000 seized. Whitmore's notes showed $38,000 actually taken, with $26,000 diverted to secure storage, meaning the vault. The family had lost everything. The father had died of a heart attack 3 months later. The mother and 3 children had disappeared into poverty. $26,000 that should have been returned to them, hidden instead in a basement for 40 years, while they suffered. Harold thought about that family, about all the families represented in these files, people who'd been robbed not just of money, but of justice, of truth, of the chance to rebuild. The money belongs to the people, Whitmore had written, held in trust until it could be safely returned. Harold understood now. This wasn't his money. It had never been anyone's money, except those it had been stolen from. And while he couldn't return it to specific victims, most were probably dead or impossible to find, he could honor Whitmore's intention. He could use it to help people who'd been forgotten. People like him and Marge. On the 6th day after mailing the letter, Harold found a response in the P.O. box. Plain white envelope, Virginia postmark. Mr. Patterson, I received your letter with great interest. If you've truly found what I believe you have, we need to meet in person. Come to Chesapeake Bay. I've enclosed contact information for when you arrive. Tell no one where you're going. Use cash for everything. Assume all electronic communication is compromised. Thomas was my friend. I owe him this much. Marcus Webb. The letter included a phone number and the name of a motel. Harold showed it to Marge that evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over their overgrown garden. It's a long drive, she said. And we'd have to leave the house unguarded. I know. Harold had thought about that. Leaving the vault unprotected went against every instinct. But they needed help. Real help from someone who understood what they'd found and how to handle it. We could take some of the money, Marge suggested quietly. Not all of it. Just enough to prove what we're saying. And enough to, she paused, choosing her words carefully, to help people. Harold looked at his wife. In the fading light, he could see the woman she'd been when they met. The fierce determination beneath the age and exhaustion. Help people how? Mrs. Chen, Marge said. Our neighbor. She's 78 years old, Harold. Working 2 jobs because her social security doesn't cover rent and her heart medication. And there are others like her all over this town. People who worked their whole lives and have nothing to show for it. People society threw away. People like us, Harold said softly. People like us. Marge agreed. What if we took some of this money, money that was stolen from people, that should have helped people, and actually used it that way? Quietly, carefully. Not to get rich, but to give others what we never had. A chance. Harold thought about the Cuban family. About the files full of stolen lives. About Whitmore's dying wish that the money served the people it was taken from. Yes, he said. But we do it smart. Small amounts, nothing that draws attention. And we document everything. So when we do expose this, we can show we weren't stealing. We were keeping Whitmore's trust. That night, they went into the vault together. Harold had been keeping a careful inventory, and he selected 10 bundles of cash. $100,000 total. It felt like an impossible amount. More money than they'd seen in their entire lives. But it was less than 0.5% of what the vault contained. They sealed the vault again, changed the combination, and the next morning, they left for Virginia. The drive took 2 days. They couldn't manage it in one stretch. Not at their age. They stayed at cheap motels, paid cash, used false names. Harold kept watching the mirrors, but he never spotted a tail. Maybe they'd been careful enough. Or maybe whoever was watching knew where they were going and was waiting to see what happened. Chesapeake Bay was beautiful in the late November light. All gray water and seabirds, and the smell of salt on the wind. The motel Webb had suggested was modest but clean. Harold called the number from the room's landline. A man answered on the first ring. Patterson? Patterson? Yes. Room 14 at the Sandpiper Inn. 3 miles south of where you're staying. 1 hour. Come alone, but bring your wife if you trust her. Come with proof. The line went dead. An hour later, Harold and Marge stood outside room 14. Harold carrying a briefcase containing copies of Whitmore's journal and select files. He knocked. The man who opened the door was in his late 70s. White hair buzzed military short, eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. He studied them for a long moment, then stepped aside. Marcus Webb, he said. Come in. They sat at a small table by the window. Webb examined the documents Harold spread before him, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he turned pages. He read Whitmore's journal entries, studied the transaction records, reviewed the surveillance logs. Finally, he looked up, and Harold saw tears in the old man's eyes. "My God," Webb whispered. "Thomas documented everything. Every theft, every person involved, every dollar stolen." He set the papers down carefully. "Do you understand what this is? This isn't just evidence of fraud. This is proof of a systematic conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. The people implicated, some are still in power, still influential, still dangerous." "We know we're being watched," Marge said quietly. "Cars following us. Our children contacted by a fake reporter. The city suddenly finding our house unsafe." Webb nodded slowly. "They've been watching that property for decades. Thomas went into hiding in '81, but they never stopped monitoring the house, waiting to see if anyone would find what he left. When you bought it, you triggered their alert system." "Why let us buy it at all?" Harold asked. "Why not just demolish it?" "Because they couldn't," Webb said, not without drawing attention. "The house sat empty for 40 years because no one wanted it cursed, people said, or jinxed. They let that superstition do their work. But eventually, the city threatened demolition, which would mean inspectors, workers, people poking around. They couldn't risk that, so they let it go to auction, figuring whoever bought it would take one look, realize they couldn't afford the repairs, and resell to one of their shell companies. Instead," he smiled grimly, "they got you. 2 elderly people with nothing to lose and everything to prove." "So, what do we do?" Harold asked. Webb leaned back in his chair, studying them. "Thomas asked whoever found this to expose the truth, but he also died terrified and alone. I've spent 26 years watching that house, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to take on what he started. Now you're here. So I'm going to ask you directly, are you prepared for what telling this story will cost? Because once we go public, your lives will never be the same. You'll be investigated, questioned, attacked. They'll try to discredit you, claim you fabricated evidence, maybe even charge you with theft. And that's if you're lucky. If you're not lucky, we might end up like Thomas Whitmore." Marge finished. Webb nodded. "Exactly." Harold looked at his wife. In the motel room's harsh light, she looked every one of her 73 years, tired, worn, her hands twisted with arthritis. But her eyes were clear and determined. "We're already dying," Harold said quietly. "Every day in that apartment, eating half portions, pretending we didn't exist that was dying. At least this way, we die for something that matters." Webb studied them for a long moment. Then he pulled out his own phone and made a call. "It's Webb. I need you to reach out to your contacts. Yes, all of them. We're going to blow this wide open." Over the next 3 hours, Webb outlined a plan. He had connections, journalists he trusted, prosecutors who'd worked with him on previous corruption cases, people at the Government Accountability Office who could receive and verify the evidence. They'd release everything simultaneously to multiple sources, making it impossible to suppress or spin. "But," Webb emphasized, "once we do this, there's no going back. You'll need to be prepared for testimony, for media scrutiny, for people trying to paint you as criminals or lunatics. Can you handle that?" Harold thought about Michael's angry face, about Sarah's tears, about the years of being invisible and dismissed. "Yes," he said, "we can handle it." They drove back to Riverside with a plan and a purpose. Webb would coordinate everything from Virginia, keeping himself at a distance to protect them. Harold and Marge would continue documenting, organizing, preparing for the moment when everything went public. But first, Harold thought, they had something else to do. Mrs. Chen lived 4 houses down from where Harold and Marge had lived in their apartment, in a rental that was barely habitable. She was 78, working as a night cleaner at an office building and a day shift at a convenience store because her Social Security didn't cover both rent and her heart medication. Harold knocked on her door on a Tuesday afternoon. When she answered, he handed her an envelope. "What's this?" she asked, her accent thick, her eyes suspicious. "Help," Harold said simply. "From someone who understands." Inside, the envelope was $10,000 in cash and a note. "For your medication and rent. From someone who knows what it's like to choose. No need to repay, just pass kindness forward when you can." Mrs. Chen opened the envelope, saw the money, and her legs buckled. Harold caught her before she fell, helped her to a chair. She was crying, shaking, saying something in Mandarin he couldn't understand. "It's okay," Marge said gently, kneeling beside her. "You deserve this. You've worked hard your whole life. This is just the world finally giving you what you should have had all along." Mrs. Chen tried to give it back. "Too much. Too much." "It's not," Harold said. "And there are no strings. No debt. Just grace." They left her crying on her front step, clutching the envelope like it was the most precious thing in the world. Harold and Marge didn't speak as they walked back to their car. They didn't need to. They both understood what they'd just done, not just given money, but given dignity, given hope, given someone the chance to stop merely surviving and start living. Over the next week, they helped others. A young single mother who worked at the grocery store where Harold bought their food. They paid off her car loan and her medical debt, $23,000 total, left in an envelope in her work locker. The veteran who lived in the woods behind the convenience store they paid for 6 months of rent at a boarding house and enrollment in a job training program. An elderly man whose medications cost more than his pension they covered a year's worth. Delivered by anonymous benefactor. They were careful. Always cash, never traceable, never drawing attention. And they documented every dollar, every person helped, every life touched. Because this was what Whitmore had wanted. Not wealth, but justice. Not hoarding, but healing. They'd helped 11 people when the children came back. Harold was working in the yard, clearing some of the overgrown weeds, when he heard the cars. 3 of them, pulling into the driveway with purpose. Michael's Tesla, Sarah's SUV, and a third car Harold didn't recognize, a Mercedes sedan with tinted windows. His stomach dropped. He called for Marge, and together they walked to the front porch as their 3 children emerged from their vehicles, along with a man in an expensive suit from the Mercedes. "Dad, Mom," Michael said, his voice tight. "We need to talk. This is Richard Sutton, our attorney." "Your attorney," Harold repeated flatly. "Not ours. We're concerned about you," Sarah said, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. "About your judgment. About decisions you're making that could affect your well-being." The attorney Sutton stepped forward, briefcase in hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, I'm here representing your children's interests. They've asked me to explore options for..." "For what?" Marge interrupted. "Taking our house? Having us declared incompetent?" Sutton's expression didn't change. "Your children are worried. They've heard concerning reports. Large amounts of cash being given away randomly. Paranoid behavior. Refusing reasonable offers for this property. They believe you may not be capable of making sound financial decisions." "We're giving away our own money," Harold said. "Are you?" Sutton pulled papers from his briefcase. Because I've done some research on this property. Its history is very interesting. Owned by a federal agent who disappeared 40 years ago. Rumors of illegal activity. And now you're suddenly giving away large sums of cash, claiming it's yours, but unable to explain where it came from. Harold's blood went cold. They knew. Somehow, they knew about the money. We bought the house legally, Marge said, her voice shaking. Everything we're doing is legal. Is it? Sutton smiled. And it wasn't pleasant. Because if you've found assets on this property, assets that may have been involved in criminal activity, there are laws about reporting that. Failure to report could make you accessories after the fact, even if you didn't know about it initially. Once you discovered it, get off our property, Harold said. Dad, please. Sarah started. No. Harold's voice was louder than he'd intended, echoing across the yard. I know what this is. Someone sent you. The same people who've been watching us, who sent that fake reporter, who got the city to threaten demolition. They're using you to scare us, to make us give up the house. That's paranoid, Michael began. Is it? Marge stepped forward, her eyes blazing. You haven't spoken to us in years. Years. And suddenly, within days of us buying this house, you all show up? With an attorney. Talking about competency hearings and financial decisions. You don't care about us. You never have. You care about whatever you think you can get. Daniel had been quiet until now. Mom, that's not true. We're worried. About what? Harold interrupted. About us giving away money to people who need it. About us finally having purpose and dignity after decades of being forgotten. Or are you worried that whatever's in this house, whatever you think we found, might not end up in your pockets? The silence was crushing. Sarah had tears on her cheeks. Michael's face was red with anger or shame. Daniel just looked at his feet. Sutton cleared his throat. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, your children have asked me to file paperwork for a competency evaluation. Given your age and the concerning behavior they've reported, a judge is likely to grant it, at which point your financial decisions could be subject to court oversight. Let them try, Marge said quietly. Let them go to court and explain why children who haven't spoken to their parents in years suddenly care so much about their well-being. Let them explain who hired you, Mr. Sutton, and who's really paying your fee. Because I doubt it's them. Sutton's expression flickered just for a moment. Harold saw surprise. He hadn't expected them to figure that out. You're making a mistake, Sutton said. This house has a history. That history will come out. And when it does, if you've been concealing evidence of criminal activity, we've concealed nothing, Harold said. And we're done talking to you. All of you. Get off our property. Now. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Michael spoke, his voice bitter. Fine. We tried to help. But when this blows up in your faces, don't expect us to fix it. We won't, Marge said. We stopped expecting anything from you a long time ago. They watched their children drive away, the attorney's Mercedes following. When the cars disappeared, Harold felt something break inside him, not painfully, but cleanly, like a bone that had been poorly set, finally snapping into its proper alignment. They're gone, Marge whispered. Really gone this time. I know. Harold put his arm around her. I'm sorry. Don't be. Marge wiped her eyes. We gave them every chance. We loved them their whole lives. But they chose. And we can't save people who don't want to be saved. That night, Harold called Marcus Webb from the payphone. They know about the money. Our kids came with a lawyer, making threats about competency hearings and criminal charges. "Then it's time," Webb said. "We move now. Before they can build a legal case against you, I'll trigger the releases tomorrow. Every news organization, every prosecutor, every oversight office gets the evidence simultaneously. Are you ready?" Harold looked through the phone booth at the Victorian house looming in the darkness. Inside was a vault full of money and evidence. Inside was proof of corruption that had killed at least one man. Inside was the rest of his and Marge's lives, however long or short that might be. "We're ready," Harold said. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Front page of the Washington Post. Massive federal fraud exposed. 40-year cover-up revealed by elderly couple in condemned house. CNN led with it. So did Fox News. By noon, it was the top story on every major news website. The details were devastating. Names of officials involved, some long dead, others still alive and influential. Operations that had been erased from official records. $187 million in documented theft and fraud. They'd agreed to report most of the vault's contents, keeping only what they'd already used to help people, which they'd documented as emergency use of discovered assets, pending proper authority notification. Harold and Marge watched the coverage from their parlor, now furnished with simple but comfortable pieces. The phone they'd finally gotten it connected rang constantly. Media requests, which they ignored, but also calls from people they'd helped, thanking them. Mrs. Chen called crying, saying she'd seen them on TV and understood now where the money had come from, and that they were heroes. Heroes. Harold had never thought of himself that way. He was just a man who'd found something that didn't belong to him and tried to do the right thing with it. Webb called that afternoon. "The Justice Department has announced a special investigation. 3 congressmen have already resigned. The FBI director is under pressure. This is bigger than I expected, Harold. You did it. You exposed what Thomas couldn't. But the cost was immediate and severe." By evening, federal agents arrived at the house. Polite but firm, they secured the vault, documented everything, treated Harold and Marge like witnesses rather than criminals, but made it clear they'd be under investigation until everything was sorted out. "You'll need to testify," one agent said. "Multiple times, probably. Grand juries, congressional hearings. This is going to be your life for a while." "We understand," Harold said. A week later, Harold and Marge gave one interview. Just one, to a journalist Webb had personally vouched for. They sat in their parlor, holding hands, and told their story simply. They'd been forgotten people who bought a forgotten house. They'd found forgotten crimes. They hadn't done it for money or fame. They'd done it because Thomas Whitmore had died, hoping someone would care enough to finish what he started. "What will you do with the money?" the journalist asked. "The portion you're allowed to keep as finders. Most of it goes back to the Treasury," Harold said. "But we've been allowed to keep some compensation for our discovery and cooperation, and we're using it to start something. A foundation. The Whitmore Trust for Forgotten Citizens. Its purpose?" the journalist asked. "To help elderly people who've been abandoned by family or failed by systems," Marge explained. "People who work their whole lives and have nothing. People who have to choose between medicine and food. People who thought they'd used up all their chances. We want to give them dignity. We want to help them believe they still matter." The interview went viral. Something about it resonated. 2 elderly people, forgotten by their own children, using found fortune not to enrich themselves, but to help others like them. Letters poured in. Donations. People sharing their own stories of being invisible, of being discarded by society. Harold hired Sarah to run the foundation. Not because she was his daughter, but because she'd spent the last 3 months proving herself. She'd apologized, really apologized, not just words, but changed behavior. She'd moved closer, spent real time with them, learned about what they were building. She'd earned back their trust slowly, painfully, but genuinely. Michael and Daniel never came back. Harold grieved that quietly, in moments when he thought Marge wasn't watching, but he'd made his peace with it. Some people, Marge had said, only love you when you're small enough to fit in their expectations. When you grow beyond that, they can't adjust. That was their loss, not his. 6 months after the story broke, the Attorney General's office finished processing the recovered funds. $187 million returned to the Treasury. $25 million kept by Harold and Marge, with the government's blessing compensation for their discovery, cooperation, and the documented good they'd already done. It was taxed, documented, completely legal. $25 million. More money than Harold could spend in 10 lifetimes. But he wasn't interested in spending it on himself. The Whitmore Trust grew quickly. They helped hundreds of elderly people in the first year, covered medications, paid rent, funded job training for those who wanted to keep working. No requirements, no strings. Just grace extended to people who'd earned it through lives of labor and sacrifice. Harold and Marge didn't advertise their role. They stayed in their Victorian house, now fully restored, beautiful in a way that honored its history without hiding its scars. The vault remained, but empty now, transformed into a small museum space about Thomas Whitmore and the courage it takes to stand against corruption. One evening, almost a year after that first dawn when they'd stood in an auction house with $800 and desperate hope, Harold and Marge sat on their front porch. The garden had been restored, flowers blooming where weeds once grew. Down the street, Mrs. Chen walked her dog paid for by the foundation. The single mother from the grocery store drove by in her paid-off car, waving. The veteran, who'd lived in the woods, now had an apartment and a job, was rebuilding his life. "Do you ever regret it?" Marge asked. "Everything we went through? The danger? The stress? Losing Michael and Daniel?" Harold considered the question. "No," he said finally. "We didn't lose them. They were already gone. We just finally admitted it. And if we'd never bought this house, then we'd still be in that apartment, rationing medicine, waiting to die. We wouldn't have helped anyone, wouldn't have exposed the truth, wouldn't have mattered." Marge leaned her head on his shoulder. "We matter now. We always mattered," Harold corrected gently. "We just didn't believe it. This house, the money, the truth we exposed, it didn't make us matter. It reminded us that we already did." They sat in the gathering dusk. Two elderly people who'd been forgotten by their children but remembered by the world. They'd exposed corruption, helped hundreds, and proved something simple but profound. It's never too late to matter. Never too late to stand up. Never too late to choose dignity over fear. Around them, the Victorian house stood solid and proud, its secrets finally exposed to sunlight, its purpose finally fulfilled. It wasn't just Harold and Marge's home anymore. It was a beacon for everyone who'd ever been overlooked, underestimated, or left behind. In the tower room, Thomas Whitmore's portrait hung above a simple plaque, "To the man who refused to let corruption win. To the agent who chose truth over safety. To the person who believed even forgotten things deserve to be remembered. Thomas J. Whitmore, 1926 to 1997." And beneath it, Harold had added a line in his own hand. He died, hoping someone would finish his work. We were honored to be those someones. Sarah came by most evenings now, bringing dinner, sharing stories about the people the foundation had helped that week. She'd become the daughter they'd always hoped for, not because she'd realized they had money, but because she'd realized they had value. That had taken losing them to understand. But she'd gotten there eventually. "Mom, Dad," she said one evening, as they ate together in the restored dining room, "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry I didn't see you. Really see you. You see us now," Marge said simply. "That's what matters." Later, after Sarah left, Harold stood in the vault-turned-museum, looking at the empty shelves where $200 million had once sat hidden. He thought about Thomas Whitmore, dying terrified and alone, about the Cuban family who'd lost everything, about Mrs. Chen choosing between medicine and rent, about all the invisible people the world had agreed to forget. And he thought about what he and Marge had built from the ruins of that forgetting. Not wealth, though they had that now. Not fame, though they'd gotten that too. But purpose, legacy. Proof that forgotten people could still change the world if they were brave enough to believe they mattered. "Thank you," Harold whispered to the empty vault, to Whitmore's ghost, to whatever force had led him to circle that newspaper listing all those months ago. "Thank you for trusting us, for believing we'd do the right thing. We tried. God knows, we tried." Upstairs, Marge was making tea, humming softly. Through the windows, twilight painted the garden gold. The phone would ring tomorrow with more requests, more people needing help, more testimonies to give. The work wasn't done, might never be done. But tonight, Harold felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Peace. Not the peace of having no problems, but the peace of having problems that mattered, of spending his remaining days, however many he had, on something larger than himself. He climbed the stairs slowly, his 75-year-old knees protesting, and found Marge in the kitchen. She handed him a cup of tea, and they walked together to the tower room, their favorite spot in the house. From there, they could see the whole town stretching toward the hills, lights coming on in windows, as families gathered for dinner. "We did good, didn't we?" Marge asked. "We did good," Harold agreed. They stood together, in comfortable silence. Two people who'd found each other 53 years ago, and somehow, against all odds, had found themselves again in a condemned house with an impossible secret. They'd been tested by greed, their children's, and potentially their own. They'd been threatened by powerful people who wanted the past to stay buried. They'd been given every reason to walk away, to stay small, to accept their assigned role as invisible, irrelevant, forgotten. But they'd chosen differently. They'd chosen truth, chosen courage, chosen to believe that two elderly people, with nothing to lose and everything to prove, could stand against corruption and win. And they had won. Not in the way the world usually measures victory, not with wealth hoarded or power claimed, but in the way that actually mattered, with lives changed, truth exposed, and dignity reclaimed for themselves and everyone they'd helped. "It's a good legacy," Harold said finally. "Better than I ever imagined we'd have. Under day life, we have one of God, we have God." "It's not over yet," Marge reminded him, squeezing his hand. "We've got time. Not a lot, but enough. Enough to help more people. Enough to make sure Thomas's sacrifice meant something. Enough to prove that forgotten people still have stories worth telling." Harold pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her tea and the lavender soap she'd always used, anchoring himself in this moment. This perfect, hard-won, impossible moment where everything had changed and nothing had changed. Where they were still just Harold and Marge, still just two people trying to do right by each other and the world. Together, he whispered, the word that had sustained them through 53 years of marriage, through poverty and heartbreak, and the slow erosion of family. Together, Marge echoed, and as night settled fully over the Victorian house on Thornhill Road, as stars emerged and the world grew quiet, two forgotten people stood in their tower room, looking out over the lives they'd touched and the legacy they were building, and understood finally what Thomas Whitmore had known all along. Some things are worth dying for. Truth is worth dying for. Justice is worth dying for. But more than that, and maybe more important than that, some things are worth living for, worth fighting for, worth refusing to stay silent for. And sometimes the people who change the world aren't the young and powerful and connected. Sometimes they're the old and forgotten and dismissed. People who have nothing left to lose except their dignity, and who decide that's the one thing they'll never surrender. Anyone can reclaim their voice if they're brave enough to remember they always had one worth hearing. Anyone can choose to matter, regardless of who's tried to convince them otherwise. Anyone can look at the hand they've been dealt: poverty, abandonment, a condemned house with an impossible secret, and decide to play it with courage and grace, and absolute conviction that they deserve a seat at the table. Harold and Marge Patterson had been left behind by their children, forgotten by a world that values youth over experience. But they'd refused to disappear. They'd refused to be nothing. And in refusing, in standing up and saying, "We matter. Our choices matter. Our lives matter," they'd changed not just themselves but hundreds of others. Because at the end of the day, worth isn't measured in dollars or followers or approval from people who should have loved you but didn't. Worth is measured in choices. In moments when you could have stayed silent but spoke. When you could have stayed small but grew. When you could have accepted your assigned role as forgotten and chose instead to be unforgettable. Harold and Marge had made that choice, and it had cost them their children, 2 of them, at least, and their peace, and nearly their lives. But it had given them something more valuable than safety: purpose, legacy, the unshakable knowledge that they'd mattered, that they'd always mattered, that no one, not their children, not powerful conspirators, not a world designed to make them invisible, could take that away. As they turned from the window and headed down to their restored parlor, to the comfortable chairs and warm lights, and the life they'd built from ruins, Harold thought about Thomas Whitmore's final words. "I pray you choose more wisely than I did. And I pray you survive the choice." They had survived. They'd done more than survived. They'd thrived. And in thriving, they'd given Thomas Whitmore something he'd died hoping for: vindication, justice, proof that his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Not bad for 2 old people who bought a house for $800, Marge said, settling into her chair with a smile. Not bad at all, Harold agreed. Not bad at all. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful true stories are waiting for you. Click now to keep discovering with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe it's never too late to reclaim your voice. Stand up for truth and prove that forgotten doesn't mean worthless. It just means the world wasn't paying attention. Until now.